The night air in Wilmington was thick, heavy with the smell of rain and salt from the nearby river. Street lights flickered along Birchwood Avenue, where laughter usually spilled from porches and open windows. But on September 17, 1998, that laughter turned to silence. A 16-year-old girl named Rachel Monroe never came home. She had plans that night, simple ones. Homework, a quick stop at the library, a call to her best friend before bed. She promised her mother she'd be back before 10. The kind of promise every teenager makes. The kind that parents trust without hesitation. But trust is fragile, and that night, it shattered. When Rachel didn't answer her phone, her mother, Alara Monroe, thought maybe the line was busy. By midnight, she was pacing the kitchen. By 2 a.m., she was outside, barefoot, clutching a flashlight, calling her daughter's name into the damp night. She checked the route to the library twice, stopping every few feet, whispering, "Please." The town woke up to the sound of sirens. Volunteers gathered at dawn, combing the streets, the parks, the edge of the river. Her backpack was found near a storm drain, soaked and empty. Inside, a few pages from her sketchbook, drawings of Wilmington's riverfront, a half-finished poem, and a ticket stub. Nothing else. People wanted to believe she'd just run away, but Alara knew. Mothers always know. Something terrible had happened, and it had happened close to home. By the third day, Wilmington stopped feeling like a small coastal town. It felt like a wound, open, festering, raw. Neighbors who'd once shared coffee and gossip now eyed each other through half-closed blinds. Who would hurt a girl like Rachel? They whispered. The answer was no stranger. It was someone the town already trusted. The Monroes' home changed overnight. The smell of lavender candles mixed with the sharp scent of police paperwork and sleeplessness. Alara barely ate. Her husband, Graham, tried to hold things together, but the walls seemed to breathe with the sound of Rachel's absence. Flyers went up on every street corner. Rachel's smile, wide and unguarded, stared back at the people who had seen her grow up. The grocery store clerk, the librarian, the man who walked his dog past their house every morning. Everyone said the same thing. I saw her that night. She looked fine. But fine doesn't mean safe. Each passing day made the town feel smaller, tighter, suffocating. Every creak in the floorboards made Alara flinch. Every phone call that wasn't the police made her tremble. She couldn't walk by Rachel's room without pressing her hand against the doorframe. "You're coming home," she whispered, though the words started to sound like lies, even to herself. Detectives promised progress. Reporters promised attention. The community promised prayer. But promises don't bring back missing girls. They just fill the space where truth should be. When the search reached its 4th week, the Monroes stopped receiving casseroles. The neighbors stopped visiting. The whispers grew colder. Maybe she was troubled. Maybe she ran away. Maybe she wasn't the angel everyone thought she was. The Monroes knew better. Rachel wasn't perfect, she was real. She got nervous before exams, wrote poems she never showed anyone, stayed up too late reading under her blanket. But she didn't run. She was taken. That truth became Alara's heartbeat, slow, steady, and unrelenting. The police would move on. The reporters would chase other stories. But Alara couldn't. Because when the world forgets, mothers don't. Before we dive in, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. If you enjoy true crime stories like this, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and share it with someone who'd love it too. Detective Virgil Stone stood on the steps of the Wilmington precinct, eyes narrowed against the flash of cameras. Reporters shouted questions he didn't bother to answer. Every news outlet within 50 miles had descended on the city, turning the disappearance of Rachel Monroe into a spectacle. For the first time in his 20-year career, Stone felt like he wasn't leading an investigation, he was being swallowed by it. The pressure was relentless. Flyers covered telephone poles, newscasters camped outside the Monroe home, and radio hosts speculated nightly. Everyone wanted a villain, and the city was happy to hand them one. His name was Lyle, the Lock Dixon, a drifter, a man with a record for petty theft, and the kind of face that made people uneasy. He lived in an old trailer near the outskirts of town and collected broken locks from scrapyards, hence the nickname. Within days, rumors spread that he'd been seen near Birchwood Avenue the night Rachel disappeared. By the end of that week, the police dragged him in for questioning. Under harsh light, Dixon swore he'd never met Rachel. He said he'd been scavenging near the docks that night, looking for scrap metal, not trouble. But it didn't matter. The press had already decided he was guilty. The Lock made good headlines, a convenient monster for a terrified town. Detective Stone wasn't convinced. Something about it felt too easy, too rushed. He spent hours reviewing witness statements, half of them contradictions. One woman claimed she saw Rachel arguing with someone near the convenience store. Another swore she saw a red-haired man driving a dark sedan near the library. Still another insisted she'd heard a scream near the docks but didn't call it in because she didn't want to get involved. It was chaos disguised as progress. When they searched Dixon's trailer, they found nothing but tools, rust, and a stack of worn books. But lodged between two floorboards was a small scrap of paper, damp, torn, and faintly scented with lilac. It was a poem. Her voice was the wind, her silence the storm. The handwriting didn't match Rachel's, but the perfume did. It was the same scent found on her backpack. The discovery sent shockwaves through the department. The poem became an obsession. Was it a clue? A taunt? Or just a coincidence in a town desperate for meaning? The police chief demanded results, the media demanded updates, and the Monroe family demanded truth. But truth doesn't thrive in noise. It needs patience. And the city had none left. When forensic testing on the poem came back inconclusive, the case began to crumble. Lyle Dixon was released for lack of evidence, but his life was ruined. The whispers never stopped. People threw rocks at his trailer, spray-painted "Killer" on his door, and drove him out of town by Christmas. The department called it momentum. Detective Stone called it failure. Because the day Dixon was released, Elara Monroe showed up at the station. Her hands shook as she held Rachel's school photo, her voice breaking with every word. "She was my baby," she said softly. "And you're all chasing shadows, while the real monster's still out there." Stone had no answer for her, because deep down, he feared she was right. Would you keep searching when everyone around you says stop? By winter, Wilmington no longer whispered Rachel's name. The crowds that had once gathered with flashlights and prayers now stayed inside. The flyers had peeled away from the telephone poles, their corners curling under the rain. Hope had gone quiet, not because the pain had faded, but because no one knew what else to say. Detective Virgil Stone sat alone in his office, surrounded by case files stacked like tombstones. Every page was a contradiction, every photo a reminder. He'd memorized Rachel's last known path, from the library to the crosswalk, past the convenience store, toward home, and then nothing. No one saw her cross that final block. No camera, no sound. Just absence. He'd been a cop long enough to know that absence is worse than death. At least death gives you a place to put your grief. Absence gives you nowhere to stand. When the results on the lilac-scented poem came back empty, no prints, no identifiable trace, the department lost interest. The police chief ordered the case shelved, citing insufficient evidence and lack of credible leads. Stone argued, pleaded, even threatened to resign. But it didn't matter. The department needed a clean record, not another headline about failure. That same week, Elara Monroe walked into the precinct carrying a box of cookies for the officers. She smiled politely as she placed them on the counter. "Thank you for your help," she said softly, voice breaking only once. No one realized what she was really doing. It wasn't gratitude, it was goodbye. 2 days later, she stopped eating. She stopped answering calls. She stopped brushing her hair, wearing perfume, or turning on the lights. The woman who once hosted neighborhood barbecues now stared out her window until sunrise, whispering Rachel's name to the empty street. Her husband, Graham, tried to hold her together. He brought in doctors, pastors, anyone who'd listen. But Elara wasn't sick, she was haunted. "They gave up on her," she said one night, voice trembling. "But I can't." She started her own search, pinning a map of Wilmington to the dining room wall, marking every place Rachel had ever been. Her handwriting grew frantic. Notes, theories, names of strangers. She sent letters to state police, FBI offices, even television hosts. Some wrote back with sympathy. Most didn't reply at all. Her grief became the town's discomfort. People crossed the street to avoid her. The church whispered about obsession, about letting go. But how do you let go of a ghost that still has your daughter's smile? One night, she found Detective Stone sitting outside her house. He'd come to tell her officially the department was closing the case. No new leads, no new evidence. Elara opened the door and said nothing. The streetlight behind him flickered, casting his shadow across her lawn. She looked at him for a long time, then said, "You can close your files, Detective. I'm not closing mine." He nodded, because what else could he do? 2 weeks later, the Rachel Monroe case file was packed into a brown box labeled Inactive, 1998. The lilac poem was sealed inside an evidence bag, forgotten among 100 other unfinished stories. But some things don't stay sealed. They breathe through the cracks, waiting for the right moment to speak again. The files were boxed, the rumors sealed, but a mother's hope stayed open. Time did what it always does. It buried the noise, the outrage, and the grief beneath the weight of new stories. By the summer of 1999, Wilmington had started to move on, even if the Monroe family hadn't. The local paper stopped printing Rachel's name, and her photo, once taped to shop windows and church bulletin boards, was replaced by new faces, new tragedies. The world didn't end the day she vanished. It just kept spinning without her. The Monroes' home turned into a shrine and a grave at once. The walls stayed the same color, the couch still faced the same direction, and Rachel's room was left untouched, bed made, books stacked, her favorite scarf still hanging on the chair. Elara dusted every corner daily, as if keeping the room clean would make her daughter walk back through the door. Neighbors didn't stop by anymore. Some couldn't bear the weight of what lingered in that house. Others had grown tired of the reminders. Even at the grocery store, people would glance away when Elara passed, pushing her cart slowly down the aisle, her eyes hollow but searching. In 2005, her husband Graham died suddenly from a stroke. Some said it was his heart that gave out. Others whispered it was grief that finished what time had started. At the funeral, Elara stood alone beside the coffin, clutching a wilted photo of her husband holding Rachel as a child. She whispered something no one else could hear. It wasn't goodbye. It was a promise that she would not stop searching. Detective Virgil Stone retired in 2007. His hair had thinned, his voice grown quiet, but his guilt never aged. He visited the Monroe house once before moving away, stood at the porch, and left a folded note in the mailbox that read, "I'm sorry we failed her." Elara never responded, but she kept the note in her kitchen drawer next to Rachel's old report cards. The case itself, marked CH 1998, was forgotten. It sat boxed on a shelf in the city's evidence storage, the label fading under layers of dust. Officers transferred, departments restructured, and files were moved to digital archives, but not this one. The folder with Rachel's name remained untouched, lost between bureaucracy and neglect. By 2010, the story had turned into a local legend whispered by dock workers and told by teenagers at bonfires. They called her the girl by the docks, saying her ghost lingered near the river, warning young women not to walk alone. The story wasn't about justice anymore. It had become entertainment, stripped of its humanity. Elara hated the way they spoke about her daughter, like she was a cautionary tale instead of a person. But she also knew that legends are all that remain when truth is forgotten. Years bled into each other. Wilmington changed new apartment complexes, rose, coffee shops, replaced diners. The old police precinct was demolished to make way for condos. But the past doesn't vanish just because you stop looking at it. It waits quiet, patient, unresolved. Every year on Rachel's birthday, Elara mailed a letter to the Wilmington Police Department addressed to the lead investigator, Rachel Monroe case. It never mattered who opened it. The letters always said the same thing. Please don't forget her. No one ever replied. By 2015, only a handful of people still remembered Rachel Monroe. Her story lived in newspaper archives and on the lips of one aging detective who still called the case his ghost. He once told a reporter, "Every town has one story it tries to bury. Ours just happens to have a name." In 2016, the Wilmington Police Department launched a new initiative, the Cold Case Division, a project built to redeem decades of unfinished business. Files that had been collecting dust for years were pulled from storage, logged, scanned, and cataloged. Most were routine unsolved burglaries, missing property reports, open thefts. But tucked between the faded boxes in the back of a dimly lit evidence room was one marked CH 1998. The handwriting was barely legible, the label torn at the edges. When Detective Cora Newmeyer brushed away the layer of dust, she saw the name written in blue ink, Rachel Monroe. She didn't know the story then, but she felt the pull immediately, that quiet, uneasy weight that sits behind every forgotten name. Cora was known in the department for her precision, her refusal to give up on details others dismissed. But more than that, she had something the older generation of cops had lost faith that old evidence still held new truths. She lifted the lid. Inside were a handful of sealed bags, an evidence log sheet yellowed with age, and a few photographs, grainy shots of Rachel's backpack, the torn fabric, the ditch where it was found. Cora set them aside carefully, her gloves trembling slightly. Something caught her eye. A small sealed envelope labeled "Found inside exterior pouch." She unfolded the evidence sheet attached to it. "Is greater than item. Fabric sample W. Scent residue. Lilac. Origin unknown." The note matched the poem clue Detective Stone had once obsessed over. But unlike in 1998, technology had evolved. Modern forensic sequencing could extract DNA from fragments smaller than a pinhead from a single strand of fiber or an oil trace left decades ago. Cora requested testing immediately. When her supervisor raised an eyebrow, "You really think something's left after 20 years?" She simply replied, "Let's find out." Weeks passed. The lab processed hundreds of samples daily, and Cora kept working other cases. But every time she passed the forensics wing, she'd glance toward the door, wondering if Rachel's box had something left to say. In February 2018, it did. A call came through just after noon. The voice on the other end was cautious, almost disbelieving. "Detective Newmeyer? You might want to sit down for this. We got a partial DNA match, not to Rachel, but to a living relative in our national genealogical database." Cora felt her pulse spike. "A relative?" she asked. "Yeah, not immediate. Looks like a cousin or nephew. Male. From the Kalin family line." The name meant nothing to her yet, but she knew what it could mean. After 2 decades of silence, the first thread had appeared. Cora spent that night digging through archived reports, combing through old witness statements, digital scans, and forgotten leads. That's when she found it buried in a 1998 transcript. Question to witness: did Rachel know anyone from the Kalin family? Answer: there's a guy, Victor Kalin, older, used to hang around the library sometimes. Her breath caught. The same name, 20 years apart. By morning, she had pinned the details to her investigation board: Rachel's last known path, the backpack, the lilac scent, the Kalin family connection. The pattern wasn't coincidence anymore. It was alignment. When Cora briefed her team the next day, silence filled the room. Most had never heard of the Monroe case. To them, Rachel was just another face in a file. But by the time Cora finished speaking, her voice steady and unyielding, everyone understood. This wasn't just about solving a case, it was about restoring a voice. The DNA sample was sent for confirmation through forensic-grade genome sequencing, FGGS, a process that could rebuild a genetic profile from even degraded samples. It would take weeks, maybe months. But patience was something Cora had learned from chasing ghosts. Before leaving the office that night, she placed the box back on her desk. She looked at Rachel's photo, clipped to the top, and whispered, "We're not done." And somewhere in the silence of that room, the hum of the fluorescent light, the low buzz of the computer fans, it felt like the air itself exhaled. Because after 20 years of stillness, the case had taken its first breath. 20 years later, a forgotten seam of fabric was about to speak. For 20 years, a killer smiled at strangers and slept in peace. Subscribe, because the truth hides longer than you think. The call came on a gray February morning, the kind of morning that felt suspended between silence and revelation. Detective Cora Newmeyer was halfway through reviewing another cold case when her phone buzzed. The caller ID showed Forensic Unit, Raleigh Division. She froze before answering. "Detective Newmeyer," a familiar voice began. "We've got your results." Her hand tightened around the receiver. The air seemed to shift. The lab technician paused. The kind of pause that separates ordinary news from something irreversible. "We got a clean male DNA profile from the fabric in the Monroe case. It's a full sequence, no degradation. That material, the seam from the backpack, was preserved better than we thought." Cora leaned back in her chair, eyes locked on the ceiling. 2 decades, 21 years of decay, rumor, and lost faith. And now, one tiny fragment of thread had carried the truth through time. "Run it through every database we've got," she said quietly. "State, federal, genealogical, I don't care how deep we dig." The tech's voice softened. "Already ahead of you. We uploaded it to the FGGS system last night. It's going through forensic genealogy analysis now. You might want to sit tight." Cora didn't sit. She walked to the evidence board that covered her office wall. Rachel's photo was pinned at the center, her wide smile now surrounded by a constellation of old names, streets, and faded theories. Cora stared at it for a long time. She thought about the woman Rachel would have been 20 years older. Maybe a teacher, maybe an artist, maybe someone who'd stopped to hold the door for strangers. Every investigation has a heartbeat, and this one was faint but stubborn, refusing to stop. 2 days later, the call came again. "Detective, you're not going to believe this." The voice carried the tremor of disbelief mixed with awe. "We have a familial match, a partial one. The system linked the DNA to a man in our database named Caleb Kalin, arrested in 2012 for a minor assault." But that's not where it ends. The analysis shows the DNA belongs to a direct male, relative older, likely a sibling or father figure. "Any names?" Cora asked, heart pounding. The line crackled. "We traced the lineage. The most probable match is Victor Kalin. He's alive. No record, no priors. Local address in Raleigh. Occupation: business owner, civic volunteer, award recipient." Cora's pen slipped from her hand. The ink rolled across her notes, bleeding into the word justice. "Wait," she said slowly. "You're telling me the DNA matches one of Wilmington's most respected citizens?" "Yes, detective. That's exactly what I'm telling you." The technician didn't need to say more. Cora knew what that meant. The case wasn't just reopening. It was about to ignite. Would you want science to uncover a truth your community chose to forget? Detective Cora Newmeyer didn't sleep that night. She sat at her desk long after the precinct emptied, the faint hum of the vending machine and the rattle of rain outside the only sounds that kept her company. Victor Kalin. The name stared back from her monitor, clean and polished, like it belonged to a man incapable of guilt. His public record was flawless: a 30-year business career, community awards, charity events, and newspaper clippings filled with praise. A man loved by the city, trusted by neighbors, and respected by everyone who mattered. There wasn't a single blemish in his file. But Cora had seen it too many times before perfection is rarely honest. She began building his timeline, cross-referencing addresses with old police maps from 1998. One address stopped her cold: Birchwood Avenue, less than 3 blocks from where Rachel's backpack had been found. Back then, Victor Kalin had been 22, just old enough to hide in plain sight. She dug deeper: phone directories, tax records, employment forms. In an old yearbook from the local high school, she found him smiling among a group of volunteers. On the same page was Rachel Monroe's art club photo. Their worlds had overlapped. Their lives had intersected. And no one had seen it. Cora's instincts, sharp and unrelenting, told her the truth was closer than anyone wanted to believe. She stared at Victor's photograph: graying hair, soft smile, the face of a man who could sell trust as easily as he'd taken life. The next step was surveillance. She couldn't confront him yet, not until the DNA confirmation was absolute. She assembled a small team, hand-picked officers who understood discretion. They followed Victor Kalin's routine for weeks: his morning jog, his volunteer work at a local youth mentorship program, his Sunday church visits. He spoke about faith, kindness, and the power of redemption. The irony was suffocating. One afternoon, as Victor walked out of a café, he tossed a coffee cup into a trash can. Cora gave the nod. The cup was retrieved within minutes. gloved hands sealing it in a sterile evidence bag. The DNA came back within a week. The result was clear, irrefutable, final. 100% match to the DNA extracted from Rachel Monroe's backpack seam. Cora read the report twice. The room around her blurred. She didn't feel triumph, she felt rage. Rage for Alara Monroe, who had begged them not to stop. Rage for the wasted years. Rage for a man who had smiled at the world while keeping its ugliest secret. She stood at the window, looking out at the city lights reflected on the wet asphalt. 20 years of silence were about to end. When she briefed her captain the next morning, the room went still. "Are you sure?" he asked, voice quiet. "I'm certain," Cora replied. "We've been shaking ghosts for too long. It's time one of them faced the light." Later that evening, she reopened the case file one last time before writing her report. Her pen pressed hard into the paper, carving each word with precision. His greater than subject, Victor Kalin. Confirmed link to evidence in 1998 disappearance and murder of Rachel Monroe. DNA verified through FGGS database. Immediate warrant recommended. She closed the folder slowly, hands trembling. 20 years of waiting had come to this moment, a whisper turning into thunder. The silence had lasted 2 decades. The truth was louder. It was barely dawn when the convoy of unmarked cars pulled into Oak Ridge Lane, a quiet cul-de-sac just outside Raleigh. The air was still, the kind that comes before a storm. Detective Cora Newmeyer sat in the front passenger seat, her hands folded tight, watching as the front door of Victor Kalin's house came into view. Clean shutters, trimmed hedges, a porch light still burning. A home that looked peaceful, undeserving of what hid inside. At 6:02 a.m., the signal came through her radio. Units move in. The team advanced with practiced precision. 2 officers approached the door while another circled to the back. The knock was firm, professional. "Mr. Kalin, this is the Wilmington Police Department. We have a warrant." There was a pause long enough for Cora to feel her heartbeat in her throat. Then the lock turned. Victor opened the door in a navy robe, his hair neatly combed, his expression calm but curious. "What's this about?" he asked, voice even, controlled. Cora stepped forward, badge raised. "Victor Kalin, you are under arrest for the abduction and murder of Rachel Monroe, Wilmington, North Carolina, 1998. His eyes barely flickered. Not confusion, not outrage, just calculation. "That's impossible," he said. "I don't know anyone by that name." "You do now," Cora replied. The cuffs clicked around his wrists. He didn't resist, didn't argue. As the officers led him down the front steps, the morning light broke through the trees, washing his face in gold. To the neighbors who peered through their blinds, it must have looked like a mistake, the arrest of a respected businessman, a man who'd organized charity drives and mentored local teens. But Cora knew better. Evil doesn't always hide in the shadows. Sometimes it waves from the driveway. Inside the house, crime scene technicians began their work. The living room was immaculate. Framed photos, shelves of leather-bound books, a piano, But in the office upstairs, the illusion cracked. Behind the filing cabinet, hidden under a false panel, they found a collection of boxes labeled by year: 1998, 2002, 2010. Each contained newspaper clippings, photographs, and small personal items, mementos from cases long forgotten. But one box was different. Inside was a silver chain with a broken clasp, a journal page stained with rain, and a photograph of Rachel Monroe clipped from the local newspaper. Cora stared at it for a long moment, then said softly, "He kept her." Back in Wilmington, the story broke before sunrise. Respected businessman arrested in 1998. Teen murder flashed across every channel. News vans lined the streets, and neighbors gathered in disbelief. When the footage reached Alara Monroe's small home, she sat motionless in her chair. The TV flickered in front of her, showing Victor being led into a police car. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. Her fingers traced the edge of Rachel's photograph on the coffee table, worn from years of handling. After 20 years, she was finally seeing the face of the man who'd taken her daughter. Her breath caught, a sound halfway between a sob and a prayer. "You took everything," she whispered to the empty room, "but you didn't win." At that same moment, as the police convoy disappeared down the street, Cora exhaled for the first time in hours. The air felt sharp in her lungs, cold, necessary, cleansing. The silence was over. The interrogation room was sterile and humming with fluorescent light, a place where the truth had no room to hide. Victor Kalin sat at the table, posture straight, hands clasped. He looked more like a man preparing for a lecture than one facing the weight of a murder charge. Detective Cora Newmeyer entered with a file in hand and placed it in front of him. Inside were photos, Rachel Monroe's, the recovered chain, the DNA report. She didn't speak at first. She wanted the silence to press down on him, to feel like time itself was turning against him. Victor finally broke it. "You have no proof I hurt anyone," he said calmly. Cora opened the folder. "Your DNA was found inside her backpack. We've confirmed it through forensic-grade genome sequencing. You remember that bag, don't you? You remember her." His eyes flicked toward the photo, but didn't linger. "You're mistaken," he murmured, but his voice had changed thinner, uncertain. Cora leaned forward. "Tell me how she ended up in those woods, Victor." He shook his head, but she saw the tremor in his hands. She slid another photo across the table, the silver chain with the broken clasp. "We found this in your office. You kept it." That's when his mask cracked. His jaw clenched, his breath shallow. For a few seconds, he said nothing. Then he whispered, almost to himself, "She shouldn't have screamed." Cora's chest tightened. "You're saying you were there." He didn't look at her. "She wasn't supposed to die. I just wanted to talk to her. I saw her at the library a few times. She was kind, always smiled. I thought she understood me. But that night," she said, "I made her uncomfortable. She tried to walk away." He exhaled, voice breaking into something hollow. "I grabbed her arm. She fought back. I didn't mean to hurt her. It just happened too fast." Cora's pen froze midair. And afterward? I panicked, he said. I took her toward the old dock road. I thought I could fix it, make it go away. His eyes glazed, lost in the memory. I buried her near the tree line by the water. The ground was soft that night. The rain helped. Every word felt like glass between Cora's fingers. He leaned back, his tone flattening. You can write your report now, Detective. You've got what you wanted. Cora stood. No, Mr. Kalin. What I wanted was the truth, and that's never yours to give again. Hours later, a search team combed through the wooded area near the riverbank. The rain had returned, soft but steady, as if the sky itself was mourning what they were about to find. Under the third marker flag, a detective called out, "We've got her!" The recovery was quiet, deliberate, reverent. Rachel Monroe's remains were taken from the soil that had held her for 2 decades. A silver bracelet was still clasped around her wrist. When news reached Elara Monroe, she didn't collapse or scream. She simply sat at her kitchen table, the same table where she'd written hundreds of unanswered letters. "She's coming home," she said, voice shaking but firm. That night, the river that had carried whispers for years seemed to move slower, heavier, as if holding its breath. For 20 years, it had guarded a secret. Now, it was finally at peace. The river had carried her story, but the truth finally reached the shore. He looked like the perfect neighbor, kind, polite, safe. Subscribe, because not every smile means safety. The courthouse filled slowly, the kind of silence that holds 100 small explosions, coughs, whispered prayers, folding chairs scraping on tile. Word had spread. Victor Kalin would plead. People arrived in jackets and Sunday dresses, faces weathered by 2 decades of waiting. Reporters set up cameras. Old friends of the defendant sat in the back, unwilling or unable to meet the eyes of those who had waited for an answer. Elara Monroe entered with a quiet steadiness that surprised everyone who'd known her as the woman who could not sleep. She held a folded photograph of Rachel, the edges softened by years of handling. At the defense table, Kalin looked diminished, his polished manner reduced to a taut stillness. He had kept his routine, his smiling civic face, even until now. The contrast between the two images, mother and accused, felt like a rupture in the fabric of the town. Inside the courtroom, the prosecutor moved with the care of a surgeon. She read facts that had been waiting 21 years for a voice. The backpack found by the storm drain, the lilac-scented scrap, the DNA match, the hidden boxes in a study that proved the accused had kept reminders of what he had taken. She did not use flourish. She let the evidence speak, measured and relentless. When Elara took the stand, the room leaned in as if sound could be caught in the air. She did not raise her voice. There was no screaming, no melodrama, only a clarity sharpened by grief. She spoke of Rachel's ordinary small rebellions, the poems slipped under doors, the sketches of the river that her daughter had left behind. She described the night she waited by the door, the way the house seemed to hold its breath. Her testimony was not a list of dates or charges. It was an accounting of everything Light had lost. Detective Cora Newmeyer followed with the quiet authority of someone who had kept a promise. She described the archival search, the lab calls in the hush of late nights, the moment a single thread became a path to truth. Her voice did not seek vengeance. It sought to stitch a broken ledger closed. She explained the genetics plainly, made the science human, turned technical sequence into a line that led straight to a man who had lived among them. The defense tried to hold on to whatever dignity remained. Character witnesses spoke of Kalen's charity work, his mentorship, the dinners he'd hosted for the Rotary Club. But each story of kindness bent under the weight of the facts. Kindness does not erase action. Good deeds did not cancel the life taken. The courtroom shifted between disbelief and something rawer, grief sharpened into anger. Throughout the day, the small poem that had once been a clue, the lilac-scented scrap, was read aloud. It sounded different now. No longer a riddle, but a ledger entry. Someone had noticed. Someone had tracked a mark, and someone had refused to let silence hold. For the first time in 20 years, the missing lines of Rachel's life were read in public and recorded in full. When Kalen rose to enter his plea, the world seemed to tilt. He spoke the words, "Guilty to second-degree murder." He did not offer a long confession. There was no dramatic unraveling, no cinematic admission. He accepted responsibility in a voice that was flat, as if he were reading a script written by the weight of what he could no longer deny. There was no relief in the room. Relief would come slowly, later, if at all. This moment was accountability, an answer rendered at last. Families in the gallery wept quietly. Some held each other. Some kept their hands folded, eyes fixed on a photograph. For Elara, the plea was a narrowing of years into a single point, the knowledge that the man who had smiled at her at neighborhood events had been the one who took her child. She rose after the plea and walked forward with a small, controlled step to present a short statement. Her voice was low, precise. "You took everything that night," she said. "You took her laughter, her poems, the plans she made. You took my sleep, my husband, and many years I will never get back. But you did not take the fact that we remember. You did not take the truth." The judge listened and then spoke to the court about the slow work of justice. He acknowledged that no sentence could return a person to life, that justice is measured in limits and protections rather than restoration. He scheduled sentencing, but the shape of the trial's outcome had already done what trials can do at their best. It gave the victim a public voice and gave the family a public answer. Outside the courthouse, people gathered in clusters, trading looks that said what words could not. Some were furious that it had taken so long. Others were sorrowful at the years lost. Conversations turned toward the structural gaps that let such tragedies linger. Underfunded departments, lost evidence, the way communities close ranks until an outsider forces them to open. The debate was fierce and necessary. The case had become more than an account of a single life taken. It had become an indictment of complacency and a call for vigilance. At the memorial service weeks later, Rachel's poems were read by her friends and by students who had never met her. Her sketches were displayed. Detective Newmeyer stood near Alara, silent, the kind of companionship that is not performative but earned. People lit candles and left flowers by the riverbank where Rachel's drawing once traced the water's edge. The crowd was smaller than the one that would have gathered had the crime been solved sooner. The time had stolen some witnesses, but its steadiness felt like repair. When the judge finally pronounced sentence months after the plea, the room listened as a mechanism of law closed in on a life. The gavel fell. The judge's words were formal, bound by statute. But the true echo of that moment lived not in the bars of a prison sentence, but in the way the community rearranged itself around the knowledge of what had happened and the promise that such a thing would be examined differently in the future. The gavel didn't end her story. It gave her voice back. When justice finally speaks, does it heal or just remind? The year after the sentencing, Wilmington felt different, not lighter, not fully healed, but honest for the first time in decades. The dockyard where Rachel had last been seen was restored into a memorial park. Locals walked by its benches every morning, some stopping to leave flowers, others pausing in silence. What had once been a place of absence became a space for presence, a reminder that even when truth takes 20 years to surface, it still rises. Alara Monroe attended every vigil, standing in the front row with the same photo she had carried through 2 decades of disbelief. Her voice was frail, her steps slower, but she never missed a single gathering. "People forget," she once said to a reporter, "unless you give them something to remember." So she gave them Rachel. Not the tragedy, not the case number, but the girl who loved lilacs and wrote poems about light on water. Detective Cora Newmeyer became a quiet figure of respect in law enforcement circles. Her cold case work led to new statewide initiatives for evidence preservation. Her name appearing in headlines not for fame, but for persistence. When asked why she stayed on cases that others called hopeless, she answered simply, "Because someone has to." It was the same stubborn grace Alara had shown, and it changed the tone of every future case in North Carolina's Cold Case Division. At the University of North Carolina, a scholarship was founded in Rachel's name, the Rachel Monroe Memorial Award for Literature and Justice. It funded essays, art, and research, exploring how stories shape accountability. The very subject that had been her passion, words became the tool for keeping her alive. In one of her notebooks recovered from home, a line written in blue ink stood out. "Some voices fade when people stop listening. Mine won't." Those words were engraved in bronze on the dock memorial. Tourists read them without knowing who wrote them, but locals did. Teachers pointed to that plaque during field trips, explaining that remembering isn't about tragedy. It's about refusing to erase the lessons pain leaves behind. Alara often returned to the river alone at dusk. She would sit on the wooden rail where the wind carried the scent of lilacs from a nearby garden and speak softly, as if to Rachel. "We found him," she would say. "You were right to hold on." That phrase, "you were right to hold on," echoed through the community long after. It became a line printed on T-shirts during the annual vigil, a phrase that meant more than closure. It meant endurance, the kind that outlasts cruelty. In 2024, the Wilmington courthouse unveiled a new wing dedicated to solved cold cases. Photographs of the victims lined the wall's faces, once lost to time, now framed in permanence. Rachel's was the first in the row, placed beside a quote from Detective Newmeyer. "Technology solves, but compassion heals." The quote became a guiding principle for officers statewide, a reminder that justice without humanity is hollow. Training programs adopted it. Prosecutors cited it in speeches. It wasn't a slogan, it was a warning against forgetting that every file number once had a heartbeat attached. For the Monroe family, legacy wasn't about erasing pain. It was about making meaning from it. Alara donated Rachel's journals to a community library, where her poems were bound into a small collection titled The River and the Sky. Copies sat by the memorial, free for anyone to take. Every few months, students from the local high school replenished the stack, proof that people still came to read, still came to remember. At the 10th annual vigil, the crowd held candles along the riverbank as dusk deepened. There was no music, no speeches, just a quiet hum of wind and water. A projector cast Rachel's photo against the courthouse wall. Her smile flickered softly, framed by the light of hundreds of candles reflecting on the river's surface. Detective Newmeyer stood beside Alara, both women looking at the same image for the 1,000th time. "Do you ever think justice is enough?" Alara asked quietly. Newmeyer took a long breath. "Justice is a stop along the road," she said. "But truth, that's the destination." A pause. Then, through the speakers, a voice recording played one of Rachel's poems, recovered from an old cassette found years earlier. "The river doesn't end where it meets the sea. It carries every name it's ever heard, quietly, endlessly. So if I ever go missing, follow the current. It remembers me." As the poem ended, the crowd remained still, candles trembling in the wind but refusing to go out. It was the same defiance that had carried Alara through her loneliest nights, the same fire that had driven Newmeyer to reopen a forgotten file. The night closed with silence, not grief, but reverence. The final words of the memorial service were spoken by Alara herself, her voice steady as she faced the crowd. "In a city of thousands, one young woman refused to be forgotten, and because she held on, so did justice."